here, a claim that it took some years to manage to publish it, but this diagram has been published now as an article in Organization Studies after 5 years trying to put it there, is basically suggesting that these are the 4 major determinants of value creation at the level of the firm. So now the question is, how do you scale it up? Now, what the claim is that if you go to the sector or the region, it's the same factors alongside the industry structure, conduct, performance, and the regional and locational characteristics. And if you go to the national level, it's exactly the same factors, but scaled up to include the institutional and macroeconomic environment, the governance and policy mix. Of course, all of these things are easily said than elaborated, and each of them you need to elaborate, and all I have elaborated at the moment is this internal ring, although this scaled up version, as I said, has recently been published also in Management International Review as the Sustainable Competitive Advantage of Firms and Nations, an article on this. But of course it's a hell of a lot more work to be done, because in many respects this is a framework of for overall value and wealth creation at the global level. But what I'm trying to do in this context is not so much at this stage these things that I describe here, but more to identify problems related with the scalability for the sustainability of wealth creation. That is, what are the constraints, the bottlenecks to sustainability which arise from a scalable model or framework rather than like this. Before this, very briefly, I claim that in this context there are 3 major players: multinational firms, large firms including multinationals and FDI, small firms and SME clusters, and the role of the government that interact and they can affect all the determinants of value and wealth creation. Of course, each of these is a paper or a section or something, it needs to be elaborated. I'm just identifying the issue at the moment in order to go to the next step. And the next step is basically that much of the extant literature in economics does not seriously take into account the issue of value appropriation and value capture. Once you do take this seriously, then you realize that there may be a trade-off between value capture and value creation, and the sustainability of value creation. And it's this trade-off that I need to address. Like firms that can capture less, equal, or more value than the one they co-create through their activities, the same can apply to the case of nations, and the sustainability of wealth creation can sometimes be compromised by the ability and the attempts by firms or by actors, individuals or nations, to capture value. And sustainable wealth creation, on the other hand, is fostered by catching up by individuals, firms or nations, and by appropriate governance. So the question is therefore, what leads to catching up, and what is the appropriate governance, and what are the limitations of appropriate governance, what are the limitations of governance for sustainable wealth creation, where are the bottlenecks? So very briefly, catching up by firms, nations and individuals require differential value capture capabilities. To effect this, agents need to decide on their competitive advantages and competitive positioning in addition to the various instruments and policies, and a relative differentiation versus relative cost matrix that I develop here is actually a step in this direction. It's meant to apply to nations but also to individuals and to firms, and this basically says that, and to individuals even, as an individual, you as students, if you try to do whatever you do in a way that either achieves high value added, high image, high differentiation, high quality, or relative to others, or is doing it in the lowest possible cost relative to others, then if you manage to be in a position that you have high image or quality with a low relative cost, with the emphasis on the relative, then you are a winner. And that applies to individuals, it applies to firms, it applies to nations, with the emphasis on the relative. So basically you can actually see that if you are in this category, you better pack up and go home. If you are in the other categories, then you really need to do something about them and move in this category. And this is something that in the paper I apply to various nations. And that paper, although it was published only in early 2009, it also discusses the competitive model, the competitiveness model of Greece, and why it was doomed to failure. Of course, the paper was published when that was already exposed, but it was written well before this, because the Greek model was basically something stuck in the middle with low relative costs by exploiting the so-called 700 euro generation and relative low quality, and managing to succeed through intergenerational transfers from the parents to the kids, who are very well educated but very badly paid. And that was a model that actually could not work for too long without upgrading, and it's now shown its limitations. But then my main problem is sustainability, and I say that sustainability is basically undermined by the fact that value appropriation strategies by individuals, firms and nations often are inimical to sustainability of value creation. And this is because, in effect, you have a number of agencies involved that need to be addressed. I look at sustainability in two levels. One, sustainability from the point of view of production, and the second, sustainability from the point of view of addressing the various agencies involved. From the production point of view, I focus on clusters. I'm not going to discuss this a lot because it will give you a nervous breakdown and we are running out of time. But basically, if you go back here, the claim is that if you do have clusters and local economic development where you embed FDI, you are more likely to create catching up strategies to effect catching up. But catching up is not the only issue. Another important issue is that there is agencies, and the agencies in the diagram I developed are between the firm and its stakeholders, the nation and the firm, and the individual nations and the globe. And the question is, how do you align the interests of these parties? Now, these issues look a bit abstract and theoretical, but if to give an example, what is being discussed today, for example, about what Germany is doing, what is the Greek situation, what exactly, it's linked exactly to this idea, aligning incentives and try to make sure that what is good for individual nation does not undermine what is good for the success of the global community. So I could elaborate on this, but again, as I said, what is being discussed now and what is being implemented at the European level is actually spot on this particular issue. Now, I'm trying also to address the fundamental issue of what is the best form of governance for sustainable value creation and wealth creation. And we have two major theoretical models at the moment. The one is global hegemony by a hegemonic power or an imperialist power, depending on where you stand on the political sort of ideology thing. Some people call it hegemonic power and they attach value to it, like Charles Kindleberger. Some people call it imperialism and they look at it as a negative thing. Of course, as everything, it has positives and it has negatives. But then the question is, could the positives of hegemonic stability be replicated by something else? And that something else, of course, is a complex thing, but pluralism and diversity with a representative global monitor, like, for example, for competition and regulation policies, may be more representative and more bottom-up. So my conclusion is diversity and pluralism that includes foreign direct investment, clusters and networking may serve as an approximation for global governance for sustainable value creation, and that in this context the representative as much as possible, global monitor could be necessary to mold and enable the process to marry direction to democracy, and this could at the very least involve a global competition regulation authority. These are old stuff, and in any event, some of this is already happening. Of course, it also they have their serious limitations. I think the single most important thing with which we are trying to address now with some colleagues, currently we are writing an article that we call it the Leibkap paradox. Leibkap is a well-known economist that has raised the question why in certain cases institutions like governments are trying to promote efficiency, and in some others they are following predatory, non-efficiency based policies. And this is the fundamental thing. How do you find out, how do you devise, how do you identify what are the conditions which need to be satisfied for governments to have incentives to become efficiency promoters as opposed to predators and in effect kleptocrats? Now this is a fundamental question, but we don't have the answer yet, and the answer is next year in this conference, hopefully. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.